The morning Etta Brenner arrived in Colton's Creek, every man leaning against the post office railing gave her exactly 3 months before she packed her trunk and caught the first stage back east. She stepped off the Butterfield Line coach on a Tuesday in September of 1878, and the dust of the Texas panhandle settled around the hem of her traveling dress like it was already trying to claim her. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned firmly under a dove-gray bonnet and brown eyes that took in the sun-bleached storefronts, the crooked water trough, the one-legged dog sleeping in the middle of the main street, and the row of men staring at her like she was a circus act arrived without announcement. She set her carpetbag down on the boardwalk, straightened her spine, and looked back at every single one of them without blinking. Nobody had asked her to come here. That was the first thing people got wrong about Etta Brenner. They assumed she had answered some lonesome rancher's advertisement in a Boston newspaper, that she was some fragile eastern flower transplanted into hard soil by desperation or romantic foolishness. The truth was simpler and less romantic by half. Her father had died in April, leaving her a parcel of land outside Colton's Creek that none of them knew what to make of, and she had come to see it for herself before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. She had no husband waiting and no intention of acquiring one. She had $62, a surveyor's map she barely understood, and a stubbornness that her late mother had called a gift and her late father had called a curse. The man who drove her bags from the coach to the front porch of Me Halliwell's boarding house was a gap-toothed teenager named Puddin, which she later learned was not a nickname but apparently just his name. Puddin told her that the town had a general store, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a saloon called the Dry Gulch that was not particularly dry, a blacksmith, a land office, and a sheriff who was older than the territory itself. He told her all of this very quickly, the way people do when they want to fill silence before it becomes uncomfortable, and she tipped him 2 cents and thanked him sincerely. Me Halliwell's boarding house smelled like beeswax and boiled cabbage, and something that might have been lavender if you were being generous. Me herself was a stout woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes that saw everything and filed it all away for later use. She showed Etta to a clean room on the second floor with a window that looked east, told her supper was at 6 sharp, and then paused at the doorway. "You the Brenner girl?" Me asked. "Theodore Brenner's daughter." "I am," Etta said. Me studied her for a long moment. "People around here knew your father some. Mostly didn't think much of him, if I'm being honest, but that's not your fault. He bought that land 8 years ago and never did a thing with it. You here to sell?" "I'm here to decide," Etta said. Me nodded like that was an acceptable answer and left her to unpack. The decision, as it turned out, was more complicated than Etta had anticipated, because when she went to the land office the next morning and spread her father's deed on the counter, the land agent, a wiry man named Creed Hollies with yellowed mustache tips and restless eyes, told her there was a dispute. "A dispute," she repeated. "Jonas Archer's been running cattle across that parcel for 6 years, Hollies said, not quite meeting her eyes. "He had an arrangement with your father, verbal agreement, no papers. Now your father's gone and Archer figures the land ought to come to him at a fair price. He's already made inquiries." "Made inquiries to whom?" "To me, mostly, and to Judge Farnham over in Amarillo." Etta folded the deed back along its creases with the precision of someone who was not going to lose her composure in a public office, even if she very much wanted to. "The deed is in my name now," she said. "My father left it to me. That is a legal document. Unless Mr. Archer has a legal document of his own, I don't believe this constitutes a dispute so much as it constitutes wishful thinking." Hollies blinked at her. He had clearly not expected her to know words like constitutes. "I'd like to ride out and see the property today," she added. "Can you arrange a horse?" She met Jonas Archer for the first time an hour later, which was not planned on either side, and was therefore perhaps the most honest first meeting a man and woman had ever had in Colton's Creek. She was riding a borrowed bay mare along the property line, comparing the surveyor's map to the actual landscape with considerable difficulty. When she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find a man pulling his horse to a stop 20 feet away with the expression of someone who had expected to be alone and was not pleased to discover otherwise. He was broad-shouldered and lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes under the brim of a worn brown hat. He might have been 30 or 32, though the lines around his eyes from squinting into the Texas sun made him look older at first glance. His horse was a good one, a gray roan that stood well and didn't fidget, and the man himself sat in the saddle the way people who have spent most of their lives on horseback do, not rigidly but with the ease of someone who cannot quite remember being on the ground. "You're on my grazing land," he said. "I'm on my property," she said. He studied her. "You're the Brenner girl." "I am tired," Etta said pleasantly, "of being called a girl by people who don't know my name. I'm Etta Brenner, I own this land." Something shifted in his expression too quickly for her to read. "Jonas Archer," he said. "I've been using this range since my father gave you verbal permission," she said. "I know," Mr. Hollis explained. "I'm sorry for your inconvenience, Mr. Archer, but I've come to assess the property and make my own decisions about it." "What kind of decisions?" "That depends on what I find." He looked out across the land then, and she looked with him, and she understood in that moment why he wanted it. The grass was good here, better than the surrounding range, and there was a creek that ran along the eastern boundary fed by some underground source that kept it running even in the dry season. It was good cattle land. It was probably good farming land too if a person put the work in. "I'm not trying to take what's yours," Jonas Archer said, and his voice had changed slightly, lost some of its defensive edge. "I'm willing to pay fair market." "I'll think about it," she said. She rode back toward town, and he watched her go, and neither of them knew yet that the whole town was already watching both of them. The watching started in earnest at supper that night, when Mee Halliwell mentioned to the 3 other boarders at her table that the Brenner girl, and here she caught herself and corrected, that Miss Brenner had ridden out to the parcel and apparently had words with Jonas Archer. By morning, it had made 3 complete circuits of the town's gossip network, which operated with remarkable efficiency for a settlement of 400 people. By afternoon, Tom Delaney at the Dry Gulch Saloon was taking informal bets on how long it would be before Etta Brenner sold the land and went back east, and the consensus was somewhere between 6 weeks and 3 months, with nobody giving odds longer than that. The thing about Colton's Creek was that it was a town that had opinions about everything and everyone, and those opinions were formed quickly and held firmly. Jonas Archer was a known quantity. He had come to the Panhandle from Missouri 5 years back with a modest stake, and had built his cattle operation from nothing through what everyone agreed was a combination of hard work and a ferocious unwillingness to fail. He was respected, which was different from being liked, though people liked him well enough too. He was quiet, kept his word, paid his debts, and had never shown any serious interest in any of the unmarried women in the county, which the unmarried women of the county had differing feelings about. Etta Brenner was not a known quantity. She was an Eastern woman with an education and a backbone and a piece of land in the wrong place, and Colton's Creek had seen Eastern women before and knew what they came to, which was usually back east. The land was hard and the work was unrelenting, and the winters were brutal, and the dust never fully went away, and the isolation was the kind that settled into your bones after enough years and either became peace or became madness, and Eastern women with educations and good shoes rarely chose to stay long enough to find out which. Etta was aware that she was being assessed. She was not unaware of it because she was oblivious. She was aware of it because she had been assessed her whole life, first as a minister's daughter who was too clever for her own good, then as a young woman who read too many books and had too many opinions, and then as a woman alone after her parents died within 8 months of each other, and she had learned to simply carry on through other people's assessments and let her own actions be her argument. She spent the first week riding the property every morning and spending her afternoons in the county records office, going through everything she could find about the land, the water rights, the adjacent properties, and the general agricultural conditions of the region. She was meticulous and patient, and she took notes in a small journal with a carbon pencil, and she asked questions of everyone who would answer them, which included the blacksmith, the feed store owner, an old Apache man who sat outside the general store most days and whose name she learned was Mateo, and who knew more about the local water sources than anyone else in the county. She also ran into Jonas Archer 3 more times that first week, twice by accident and once because she deliberately rode out to the eastern boundary to ask him something she couldn't find the answer to in any record. "The creek," she said, pulling her mare up beside his roan on a cool Thursday morning with the sky the color of new tin. "Does it run year-round or does it dry up in August?" He looked at her sideways. "Year-round," he said. "Mostly. Gets low in late summer, but it's never gone dry in the 5 years I've been running cattle here. The grass quality on the western portion," she continued, "is that consistent or does it vary by season?" He was quiet for a moment and she got the impression he was deciding something. "Better in spring," he said finally. "Drops off some in July and August, picks back up in October. It's good land, better than most of what's in this county." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not selling it." He turned to look at her directly then. "What are you going to do with it?" "Farm it," she said. "Cattle on the western portion, grain on the eastern sections near the creek. I need to get through winter first and assess the soil properly in spring, but that's the plan." The silence that stretched between them was long enough that a hawk made 2 complete circles overhead before he spoke. "You know anything about farming?" he asked, and his tone was not unkind, more like he genuinely wanted to know before he formed a conclusion. "More than I did a month ago," she said. "Less than I'll need to, that's what winter's for." "It's September," he said. "You've got maybe 5-6 weeks before first frost." "Then I'd better get started," she said, and turned her horse and rode back toward the property boundary. She heard him say something behind her, quiet, almost to himself, and she thought it might have been Lord Almighty. But she couldn't be certain and didn't turn back to ask. She bought the property outright from any remaining dispute by filing the proper paperwork with Judge Farnham's office in Amarillo, a process that took 2 weeks and cost her $14 in filing fees and 6 letters written in her firmest hand. And when it was done, Creed Hollis told her congratulations in a tone that was not entirely convinced, and Jonas Archer said nothing at all for 3 days, which she learned from me Halliwell meant he was genuinely thrown by something. "He's a stubborn man," me told her over breakfast on a Friday in early October. "But he's not a bad one. He was counting on that land, though. He's got cattle to winter somewhere." Etta had thought about this. She had thought about it quite a lot, actually, turning it over in her mind on the evenings when the boarding house was quiet, and the wind came down off the high plains and rattled the window glass. She had not come to Colton's Creek to be cruel to a man who had spent years building something. She had come to decide what to do with something her father had left her, and she had decided, and now she needed to figure out how to do it without destroying what Jonas Archer had already built adjacent to her land. On a Saturday morning when the sky was pewter and the air smelled like the winter that was coming, she rode out to Jonas Archer's ranch, a modest operation with a solid barn and a main house that was small but well-maintained, and she tied her horse at his fence post and knocked on his door. He answered it in his shirt sleeves with a cup of coffee in his hand and an expression that moved through surprise, wariness, and something she couldn't name, all in the space of 2 seconds. "Miss Brenner," he said. "Mr. Archer," she said, "I have a proposal. A business proposal," she added, because his expression had shifted in a way that made her want to be precise. "May I come in?" He stepped back and led her into the main room of the house, which was plain and clean and smelled like coffee and wood smoke. There was a table with 2 chairs, and she sat in one and spread her map on the table, and he pulled the other chair out and sat across from her with his coffee cup and looked at her like she was something he couldn't quite figure out. "The western parcel," she said, pointing to the map. 240 acres. You've been grazing cattle there for 6 years and you know the land better than anyone. I don't want cattle, I want grain. But I don't know enough yet to work the land efficiently, and you have cattle that need winter range. She looked up at him. I'd like to propose a leasing arrangement. You keep your cattle on the western parcel through this winter. You pay me a fair lease rate which I'll use to fund what I need to build for spring. In exchange, you share with me what you know about the land and the water and what works here. Come spring, we reassess. He was very still for a moment. Outside the window, a crow called twice and was silent. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because it makes sense," she said. "You need winter range. I need money and information. Neither of us has to lose anything. Most women in your position would just sell." "I'm not most women in my position," she said, and he looked at her for a long enough moment that she felt the back of her neck get warm. "No," he said quietly, "you're not." They shook hands across her father's surveyor's map, and the deal was struck. And outside the boarding house that evening, Mee Halliwell mentioned to the Reverend's wife that she thought Jonas Archer and the Brenner girl had come to some arrangement. And by Sunday after services the whole town had heard, and the prevailing opinion was that whatever arrangement they had come to, it would not last the winter. Tom Delaney at the Dry Gulch opened a new round of betting. He was a cheerful man about it, as saloon keepers usually are, because nothing makes better business than human beings disagreeing about inevitable outcomes. What nobody was betting on was that Jonas Archer would spend the next 3 months becoming something he had not intended to become, which was the person Etta Brenner called on when she needed to know something. It started practically. He knew when the creeks in the region froze and when they thawed. He knew which of the rocky outcroppings on the eastern portion of her land were good windbreaks, and which ones channeled the wind in ways that would damage crops. He knew which of the local feed merchants was honest, and which watered his grain deliveries. He knew how to read the sky for weather in a way that no book could teach, and she noticed this and asked him once how he had learned, and he said that his grandfather had taught him when he was a boy in Missouri, and that his grandfather had learned from an old Osage man who had walked him through it over the course of a summer. And she listened to this with complete attention the way she listened to everything, and he found himself telling her more than he had intended to. She was an exceptional listener. That was the first thing he had not expected. Most people who asked questions were really just waiting for their turn to talk, but Etta Brenner asked a question and then actually listened to the answer, all of it, without interrupting or redirecting. And when he was done, she asked a follow-up question that showed she had understood what he said and had thought about it. It was unsettling in the way that genuinely unusual things are unsettling, not frightening, just unfamiliar enough to require adjustment. The second thing he had not expected was that she was funny. She was very dry about it, and she delivered observations about the absurdities of her situation with such a straight face that sometimes he was halfway through a response before he realized she was joking, and then he would stop and look at her, and she would be fighting a smile. And he found that he liked fighting a smile Etta Brenner considerably more than he was comfortable admitting to himself. In November, 2 things happened that changed the texture of what was growing between them. The first was a fence dispute with her western neighbor, a third-generation cattle rancher named Burl Swan, who was not a bad man, but who was the kind of man who had been getting his way in Colton's Creek for 20 years by simply being louder and more persistent than anyone around him. Burl Swan had been quietly extending his fence line for 2 years, taking a little ground here and a little there. Nothing dramatic enough to provoke a legal response but consistent enough to add up, and he had been doing it to Jonas Archer's leased section of Etta's land. And when Etta rode out to check the boundary markers and found that Burl Swan's fence was a full 9 feet over her legal property line, she was not pleased. She went to Burl Swan directly, which was not what anyone expected her to do. She rode to his property on a gray Tuesday morning and knocked on his door with the same directness she brought to everything, and Burl Swan came out with his 2 sons behind him and looked at her the way men like Burl Swan look at lone women with legitimate complaints, which is to say he looked at her like the complaint was the problem rather than what it was a complaint about. "The line's where it's always been," Burl said. "The line is 9 feet east of where the original survey marks it," Etta said. She had brought the survey documents folded in her coat pocket, and she unfolded them now. "I've marked the original boundary stakes and the current position of your fence on this map. I'd like the fence moved back by the end of the week." Burl looked at the map and then looked at her and then looked at his sons and back at her. "Little lady, you don't know what you're looking at." "I know exactly what I'm looking at," Etta said, her voice perfectly level. "And I know that if the fence is not moved by Friday, I'll be filing a formal boundary complaint with the county surveyor's office and asking for an official resurvey, which will cost you considerably more than moving the fence." She rode away and Burl Swan watched her go and said several things to his sons that were not complimentary. That evening, Jonas Archer showed up at Me's boarding house on the pretext of returning a book she had lent him, which was a slim volume on soil composition that she had ordered from a bookseller in Fort Worth. He found her on the front porch in the cold, wrapped in a wool shawl, and he told her what he had heard about her visit to Burl Swan, because in Colton's Creek everything was heard everywhere within hours. "He's going to make trouble," Jonas said. "He can try," she said. "I know him better than you do." He leaned against the porch rail looking out at the street. "He won't move the fence." "Then I'll file the complaint," she said. "He has friends at the county office." She turned to look at him. "Do you think I should back down?" There was a pause, and she watched him work through whatever he was thinking, and then he shook his head. "No," he said. "I think you should stand your ground. I just want you to know it's going to be a fight." "Most worthwhile things are," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her in the pale evening light, and she looked back, and neither of them spoke for a moment that went on slightly longer than the content of their conversation required. "I'll go with you when you file the complaint," he said. "If you want, I know the county surveyor. He's an honest man." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought she was going to say she didn't need help, which was probably true, but what she said was, "I'd appreciate that. Thank you, Jonas." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she had done it without thinking about it, and he heard it like a chord struck on an instrument he had not known was in the room. "Etta," he said, also without thinking about it, and her name in his voice did something very similar to her. The fence dispute was resolved by the 3rd week of November. Jonas accompanied her to the county surveyor's office in the next town over, and the surveyor, a careful German immigrant named Heinrich Bauer who had no patience whatsoever for imprecise boundaries, conducted an official resurvey and confirmed that Etta's measurements had been exactly correct. Burl Swan moved his fence. He did not do it graciously, and he let it be known around town that he considered the whole business a personal insult, but the fence moved, and that was what mattered. The second thing that happened in November was smaller, but perhaps more significant. On a Wednesday afternoon when the sky had gone the particular white that precedes a hard frost, Jonas came by the property to check on the cattle and found Etta there, trying to repair a section of the old corral fencing that had rotted through. She was doing it wrong, using green wood that would warp and crack before spring, and her hands were bleeding slightly from a splinter she had not stopped to attend to, and she was absolutely not going to admit defeat to a section of fence. He got down from his horse without saying anything and took the hammer from her hand with a look that was not condescending but simply matter of fact, the way you would take a hammer from someone who was using it wrong without implying anything negative about them as a person, and she let him take it, which surprised both of them somewhat. "Green wood," he said, looking at the boards she'd brought. "I know," she said. "I couldn't find dry wood at the merchant's. This was what he had." "I've got seasoned lumber at the ranch. I'll bring it tomorrow." He looked at her hand. "You're bleeding." "I noticed," she said. He took her hand in both of his and turned it palm up to look at the splinter, and the contact was so sudden and matter of fact that she didn't have time to pull back, and he found the splinter with his thumbnail and extracted it with the swift efficiency of someone who had done this before, and then he held her hand for a moment longer than strictly necessary, both of them looking at it in the cool gray light, and when he looked up she was already looking at him. He let go of her hand. She thanked him. He said it was nothing. She said she would pay him for the lumber. He said she didn't need to. She said she would pay him anyway. He said fine. They stood there for another moment in the cold air, and then he got back on his horse and rode away, and she stood in the field holding her mended hand and watched him go and thought several things she was not yet ready to say out loud. December in the Texas Panhandle is not the kind of winter that kills you quickly. It is the kind that wears at you slowly, with wind that finds every gap in every wall and cold that settles in before the sun comes up and doesn't lift until noon. It is beautiful in the way that hard things often are, the high plains going silver and pale under thin cloud, the creek freezing along its edges in patterns like lace, the cattle standing in their winter coats with their breath rising in small clouds. Etta had moved into the small house on her property by early December. It had been her father's intention to build something there someday, and he had gotten as far as a one-room structure with a good fireplace and a solid roof before he stopped, and she had spent 3 weeks before winter hit properly making it livable, with help from Halliwell's recommendation of a local handyman named Clarence, who was 70 years old and the most competent person she had met in Colton's Creek. She had a proper bed, a writing table, a stove for cooking, and enough firewood stacked against the north wall to get her through to February if she was careful. Jonas checked on her more often than the lease arrangement strictly required. He told himself it was because he was checking on the cattle. She told herself she didn't mind because he knew things about the land she was still learning. They both knew that neither of these explanations was entirely adequate, but they were useful, and so they continued using them through December. He taught her how to read the signs of incoming blizzards. She lent him 2 books from her collection that she thought he might find interesting. One on animal husbandry methods from the Virginia Agricultural Journals, and one that was just a novel by a writer named Thomas Hardy that she liked and thought he might too. He came back 3 days later and said he'd read the Hardy overnight and wanted to talk about it, and they talked about it for 2 hours at her kitchen table with the fire burning and the wind pushing against the windows, and it was the best conversation she could remember having in years. Christmas came and the town held a service at the church and a modest gathering at the Halliwell place, which was large enough to accommodate most of the town's families, and Etta attended and found herself standing near Jonas Archer by the fire while his cattle foreman, a wide and cheerful man named Colton, told a story about a coyote that had gotten into the bunkhouse and the subsequent chaos. And she laughed at the story, and Jonas looked at her with an expression that she caught just before he smoothed it into something more neutral, and what it had been, she thought, was something close to adoration. She thought about that look for several days. On New Year's Eve, a group of children from the town came caroling through the main street, bundled in their coats and singing off-key with total conviction, and Etta stood in her doorway to listen and found Jonas standing at her fence gate, leaning on it, listening with her. "Happy New Year," he said, when the children had moved on and the singing faded into the cold air. "Happy New Year," she said. "1879, he said. "Hard to believe it's been almost a year since I thought my grazing arrangement was settled." "Are you sorry it didn't work out the way you planned?" she asked. He thought about it with his characteristic honesty. "No," he said, "I don't think I am." The silence between them was comfortable and warm despite the cold air, and she thought that she was going to say something. She wasn't sure what, but something real. And then Colton came riding up the lane hollering that one of the heifers had gotten through a fence section and Jonas had to go, and he went, touching his hat brim to her as he mounted. And she went back inside and stood by her fire, and understood with a sudden and somewhat exasperating clarity that she was entirely in love with Jonas Archer. She sat with this knowledge for a week. It was the sort of knowledge that required sitting with, she felt, rather than acting on immediately, because she was a practical woman and she wanted to be certain she understood what she was feeling before she did anything about it. She was in love with him. She had established that. The question was what to do about it. The question was made more complicated by the fact that she genuinely couldn't tell what he felt. Or rather, she thought she could tell and was afraid of being wrong, because being wrong would change everything about an arrangement that had become the best part of her daily life, and she did not want to risk that carelessly. In mid-January, something happened that resolved at least one part of her uncertainty. There was a storm, a proper panhandle blizzard that came in overnight on a Thursday and dropped 2 feet of snow by Friday morning and kept going. Etta had enough food and firewood to be comfortable, and she was not worried about herself. But she was worried about the cattle on the western parcel, because the fence on the northern section was old, and she wasn't certain it would hold against the weight of animals pressed against it by the wind. She woke on Friday morning to the howling wind and the whited-out window and was in the process of deciding whether to try to get to the western section when she heard hoofbeats and then a knock at her door, and she opened it and Jonas was there, covered in snow, his roan standing behind him with its ears flat. "The north fence held," he said before she could ask. "I already rode it. The cattle are sheltering in the draw on the far west. They'll be fine." She stared at him. He had ridden out in a blizzard to check her fence before she could worry about it. He was standing on her porch in the snow as if this was a perfectly ordinary thing to have done. "You rode out in this," she said. "I needed to check my own cattle anyway," he said. "Jonas." "What?" "Come inside," she said. "You're covered in snow." He came inside and she took his coat and hat and hung them by the fire and made coffee, and he sat at her table and she sat across from him, and for a moment they just looked at each other with the blizzard raging outside and the fire making everything inside warm and gold. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Why did you?" He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had been cataloging all these months, the one that was more honest than he probably intended. "Because I knew you'd worry," he said, "and I didn't want you to worry." She put her coffee cup down very carefully. "Jonas," she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said, and he went very still in the way he did when something important was happening. "I came here to decide about land," she said, "and I decided about land. But somewhere in the middle of all of it I decided something else too, and I've been sitting with it for a while to make sure I had it right, and I do." She looked at him steadily. "I love you. I'm not asking you to do anything about that. I just thought you should know." The fire popped. Outside, the wind went around the corners of the house. Jonas Archer, who was not a man given to impulsive action, pushed his chair back and stood up and came around the table and took her face in both his hands, which were warm now from the fire, and looked at her for one long moment as if making certain this was real, and then he kissed her. It was not a tentative or uncertain kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting longer than he knew to do exactly this, and she put her hands on his wrists and kissed him back with equal conviction, and when they broke apart, they were both breathing a little faster than coffee and conversation warranted. "I love you," he said, and his voice had a roughness in it that was new and also entirely right. "I've been trying to figure out how to say that for about 2 months without ruining something I didn't want to ruin." She laughed, and it came out warmer and more open than she usually allowed her laughter to be in company. "We've been very careful with each other," she said. "Too careful," he said. "Well," she said, "we're not being careful now." The blizzard went on for 2 days and Jonas stayed at her property, because the roads were not passable, and she had an extra blanket, and no one in Colton's Creek needed to know anything about it. He slept by the fire and she slept in her bed, and they talked until late each night about everything and nothing, about Missouri and Boston, and what their childhoods had been, and what they had wanted from their lives, and whether they had gotten any of it. And she told him about her father and he told her about his parents, and they told each other true things in the firelight in the way that 2 people do when they are done pretending to be less than they are. By the time the storm cleared and Jonas rode back to his own ranch, something had changed between them that was not going to change back, and he did not try to make it seem smaller than it was, and neither did she. The town of Colton's Creek found out about the general situation within about 48 hours, because in a town of 400 people with limited winter entertainment and an active interest in other people's lives, 2 days where Jonas Archer's horse had apparently been at the Brenner property, and Jonas Archer had not been at his own ranch, was the kind of information that traveled fast. The conclusion most people drew was the obvious one, and the reaction was divided. Some people were pleased, in the way that people are pleased when two individuals they find interesting do something interesting together. Me Halliwell, for instance, said only, "I knew it," and went back to her kitchen with the air of someone whose prediction had been confirmed. But a significant portion of Colton's Creek was something other than pleased, and the reason was various. There were people who thought Etta Brenner was too strange and too Eastern and too independent to make any kind of suitable partner for a man with a cattle operation to run. There were people who thought Jonas Archer had let himself get distracted from building his business by a woman who would leave when things got hard. There were people who had opinions about Eastern women keeping house on the frontier. And there were people who just liked to be skeptical of anything that looked like it might turn out well, because they had been skeptical long enough that it had become a personality trait. Tom Delaney at the Dry Gulch had a new proposition for his betting board. He started taking odds on whether Jonas Archer and Etta Brenner would ever actually get married, and the odds were not favorable. The prevailing sentiment was that whatever was happening between them was the sort of thing that happened in winter when people were isolated and cabin-fevered, and that it would dissolve when the spring came and brought perspective along with the warmer air. Jonas heard about the betting board from Cal Purdue, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a man who is not sure how the news will be received. Jonas's response was to say nothing at all for a full 30 seconds, which was his version of a strong emotion, and then to say, "People are going to think what they're going to think," and go back to his work. Etta heard about it from Clarence, the handyman, who mentioned it with considerably less neutrality and a fair amount of indignation on her behalf. Her response was to feel something that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, but was somewhere in the territory of both, and then to put it away and think about the grain inventory she needed to plan for spring, because she was not going to let Tom Delaney's betting board run her life. But it stayed with her, as small indignities do. It stayed in the way that it marked a clear and distinct line between what she had hoped for and what the town was prepared to offer her, which was a sort of provisional tolerance extended as long as she conformed to their understanding of what she was, which was temporary. The moment she showed signs of becoming permanent, of making choices that rooted her here, of loving someone who belonged here, they closed ranks in the way that small communities do, quietly and without announcement. She talked to Jonas about it on a Sunday afternoon in late January when they were riding the property line together, which had become a regular and useful habit that also happened to be the part of her week she looked forward to most. "Does it bother you," she asked, "what people are saying?" He rode beside her in the pale winter sun and thought about it. "A little," he admitted, "mostly because it concerns you. It concerns both of us." "Yes," he looked at her. "What do you want to do about it?" She looked back at him. The creek was frozen at its edges and the winter grass was pale gold under the blue sky, and she could see 3 hawks making lazy circles over the western pasture. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to build what I came here to build, and I want to do it with you if you want that too." She paused. "I'm not asking you to prove anything to anybody. I'm just telling you what I want." He said nothing for a long moment, and she had learned by now that his silences were not evasions but thought, and she waited. "Etta Brenner," he said finally, "will you marry me?" She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her directly, seriously, with that dark-eyed steadiness that had undone her from the beginning. "That was a very sudden question," she said. "I've been thinking about it since November," he said. It only sounds sudden." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Yes," she said, "I will." The engagement became known in Colton's Creek approximately 4 hours later, because Jonas Archer stopped at the general store on the way back to his ranch to buy supplies and mentioned to the owner that he would need Miss Brenner's opinion on the selection of coffee beans, since they would soon be sharing a household. And that was enough. Tom Delaney updated his betting board to reflect the new development. The odds on a wedding happening at all were still not especially favorable. The odds on the marriage lasting through summer were longer still. The general sentiment was that Etta Brenner would get a look at what married life in a one-room house on the panhandle actually entailed and find a reason to reconsider, and that Jonas Archer would discover that an independent Eastern woman was more complicated to build a life with than a more conventional choice would have been. The wedding was on a Saturday in March, 6 months after Etta had stepped off the Butterfield coach with her carpetbag and her surveyor's map. Reverend Colton performed the ceremony at the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the building was full, because, whatever people's opinions about the outcome, nobody in Colton's Creek was going to miss this. Etta wore a dress she had made herself from a length of deep blue wool she had ordered from the merchant in Amarillo, and she carried a small bunch of dried prairie grass and late winter sage tied with a ribbon, because there were no flowers in March in the Texas Panhandle, and she thought the prairie grass was honest and fitting, and she liked it better than flowers anyway. She had done her hair herself, pinned up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, and she walked down the aisle of the church with her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes on Jonas, who was standing at the front in his good coat with his hat held in both hands, and who looked at her walking toward him with an expression that several women in the congregation described afterward as the most purely joyful thing they had ever seen on a man's face. They made their vows in the simple, clear language of the traditional ceremony, but when the Reverend gave them the opportunity to speak their own words, Jonas set aside the quiet economy that was his usual mode and spoke. "I came to this country to build something," he said, his voice carrying through the church without effort. "And I built some of it, but I didn't know what I was building until you arrived and told me what this land could be, and I think that's true of more than just the land." He looked at her steadily. "I will spend whatever time I have being worth what you came to." She had promised herself she would not cry, and she did not, but it was a close thing. When it was her turn, she said, "I came here to make a decision about land and made a different kind of decision instead. I have never been less sorry about being wrong in my life. I love you, Jonas Archer, and I intend to give that love the same attention and stubbornness I give to everything else, and I think you know by now that that is a considerable amount." There was laughter in the church, warm and real, and Jonas smiled at her with such open happiness that it moved through the room like a wave. Reverend Colton pronounced them married and Jonas kissed her, and the congregation applauded, which Reverend Colton technically discouraged in the house of God, but did not discourage on this particular occasion because even he was caught up in it. The reception was at Mee Halliwell's, who had volunteered her house and had baked enough for twice the people who showed up, which means she had baked for what actually showed up, which was nearly the entire town. There was fiddle music and a caller who got a Virginia reel going in the front room, and Jonas danced with Etta twice, and then watched her dance with Cal Perdue and Clarence, and even old Mateo, who turned out to have a surprisingly elegant sense of rhythm. And he stood with his back against the wall with a cup of cider, and watched her move through the room and talk to his neighbors, and felt something he did not have a precise word for, which was probably just happiness of the uncomplicated variety. The kind that doesn't need language because it is simply present. Mee Halliwell, standing beside him for a moment in the particular way that older women stand beside young men at wedding parties when they have something to say, told him quietly that the Brenner girl, and here she paused and corrected herself firmly, that Etta was going to be good for this town whether the town knew it yet or not. "She already is," Jonas said. Me nodded and moved on to refill someone's cup. Tom Delaney at the Dry Gulch did not attend the wedding, being a man who found weddings intrinsically uninteresting except as data points for his betting operations. But his bartender attended and reported back, and Tom adjusted his board to reflect that the wedding had in fact occurred and shifted his active propositions to the longevity questions. The spring came slow, and then all at once, the way springs do in the panhandle. A day of warmth followed by a return of cold, followed by a week where the temperature climbed steadily, and the grass went from pale gold to green almost overnight, and the creek ran higher and clearer from the snowmelt in the hills to the north. Etta and Jonas had moved into his ranch house in the weeks after the wedding, while Etta's small property house was being expanded, which Clarence was overseeing with Jonas's assistance on weekends. The ranch house was small for 2 people, but they were both people who carried their own interior space with them and didn't require much physical room to feel comfortable, and they fell into the rhythms of shared life with a naturalness that surprised Etta somewhat, because she had lived alone for long enough to wonder if she would find another person's constant presence irritating. She did not find Jonas's constant presence irritating. She found it, in fact, like breathing, something that became so necessary so quickly that she couldn't quite remember what it had been like without it, and that was a thing she had not anticipated and was very glad to discover. In March, 3 weeks after the wedding, she began the planting preparation on the eastern portion of her land. She had ordered grain seed from a cooperative in Fort Worth based on the analysis she had done over the winter, and she had hired 2 hands from among the young men in the county who needed work, brothers named Henry and Will Foster, who were 19 and 21, and came well recommended by Mateo, who said they were careful workers and worth the wages. Jonas helped where he could and stepped back where he should, which was a distinction he navigated with a care that she noticed and appreciated. He had his own operation to run and did not try to absorb hers, but when she needed an extra pair of experienced hands, he was there, and when she needed to think through a problem out loud, he was also there, and when she had successfully plowed the first proper furrows through the eastern field on a windy April morning and stood in the turned earth with the smell of it coming up around her, he rode over and got down from his horse and stood beside her and said nothing. Just stood there with her in the turned-up earth, which was exactly the right thing to do. By April, the town's opinion was beginning to shift, not all at once and not without resistance, but perceptibly. It shifted for small reasons that accumulated. Etta had organized a women's book exchange through the church, which was modest in scope, but had drawn interest from women who had not previously had access to anything beyond the Bible and the weekly newspaper. Jonas had quietly been supplying emergency feed to 3 small operation ranchers who had a bad winter without making a public matter of it. Together they had contributed labor to the rebuilding of the South Bridge on the main road after February flooding, working alongside every other family in the county who could spare hands. They were becoming, in the language of the place and time, good neighbors. And good neighbors were valued in the Panhandle the way few other things were, because the survival of everyone in a region like this depended on the community holding together, and people who contributed to that holding together earned their place regardless of where they had come from. Burl Swan remained aggrieved, which was consistent with his character. He made occasional comments at the feed store and the Dry Gulch about Eastern women who thought they knew how to run ranch land, and about men who let a woman run their decisions, and these comments were received by fewer people each month with sympathy. The grain came up in May. It came up imperfectly, as first-year crops often do, with thin patches in 2 sections where the soil was rockier than the map had suggested, and she assessed the imperfection carefully and noted what she would need to adjust in the following year, and the overall yield was not what it would eventually become, but it was real. There was grain growing on her father's land, on her land in the Texas panhandle, planted by her own hands and tended by hers and Jonas's and the Foster brothers, and growing under the wide blue sky of a place that was becoming, without her entirely having decided it would, home. Tom Delaney looked at his betting board in May and made a decision. He took it down. He told his bartender that the odds had gone too unfavorable and it wasn't worth keeping, which was the closest Tom Delaney was going to come to admitting that he had been wrong. And the bartender told several people, and the several people told several more people. And it got back to Etta eventually, by way of me Halliwell, who told her with considerable satisfaction in her voice. Etta's response was to smile, a small private smile over her morning coffee, and say, "Well, good." Jonas's response when she told him that evening was quieter. He looked out the window at the darkening sky over the western pasture and said, "I could have told them in September." "Told them what?" "That you were going to stay," he said. "That you were going to make this work. I knew it the first week." She looked at him. "You thought I was trouble the first week." "Knowing something is going to stay and thinking it's trouble aren't mutually exclusive," he said, and she laughed and he grinned at her, and she thought for the 100th time that she loved his grin, the way it broke open the usual composure of his face and showed something entirely unguarded and warm. Summer came with its full weight of heat and long days, and the work that does not relent in the ranching and farming life, and they moved through it together with the ease of two people who have found a shared rhythm and trust it. There were arguments, because they were both strong-willed people, and arguments are what strong-willed people have sometimes when they care about the same things and see them differently. And the arguments were direct and sometimes sharp and always resolved. And what Etta found was that resolving a real argument with Jonas was a more satisfying experience than agreeing about everything with most people she had known. Because he was honest in his disagreements and genuinely open to being persuaded by a good argument, and so was she, and that was a rarer thing than it should have been. In July, they got news that Etta's cousin in Boston had had a child, and the letter reached her on a hot afternoon, and she read it sitting on the porch with the fan working ineffectively against the heat, and she felt something complex that she sat with for a while before speaking to Jonas about it. "Do you want children?" she asked that evening in the direct way that she asked most things. He was washing up at the basin and he turned to look at her. "Yes," he said. "If you do." "I do," she said. "I've been thinking about it." "Me too," he said, "for a while." She nodded, and what they had just decided settled between them the way their important decisions always did, quietly and firmly and without drama. By autumn of 1879, a year after Etta had arrived in Colton's Creek, the town had reached a collective understanding about Etta and Jonas Archer that was not quite the one it had started with. They were not the short-lived novelty act that most people had predicted. They were not a cautionary tale about mismatched expectations. They were two people who had built something real in a year, both the literal something of an expanding farm operation and a ranch that was doing better than the previous year, and the less tangible something that showed in the way they moved through the town, in the ease of their company and the quality of their attention to the people around them. Me Halliwell, who tracked these things with the thoroughness of a town historian, said at her supper table one October evening that she had never in 20 years of running a boarding house seen a marriage take hold the way that one had taken hold, and she meant it as the highest possible compliment. The second year of their marriage brought more of the work and more of the learning and more of what Etta had come to think of as the particular texture of their life together, which was not smooth or simple, but was vivid and honest and full of the kind of moments that accumulated into something worth having. In early spring of 1880, she told Jonas she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of their now expanded house on the property, which Clarence had built out to 3 proper rooms with a sleeping loft and a covered porch that ran along the eastern side, and which was now unambiguously home in a way that the word had never quite fit anywhere she had lived before. Jonas stood very still for a moment when she told him, and then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her and held her with a fierce gentleness that said everything he was not yet finding words for. "Good," he said into her hair. "Good." She held on to him and felt the solid realness of him and the solid realness of everything around them, the house and the land and the life they had made, and thought that her father's peculiar, useless, necessary parcel of Texas earth had turned out to be the best thing he had ever left her, not because of what it was worth, but because of what it had led to. The pregnancy was not difficult. She was healthy and practical about it in the way she was practical about most things, continuing her work through the summer as her shape changed, and the heat came down, and Jonas quietly took on more of the harder physical tasks without making a production of it. And she let him, which was its own kind of love, this business of knowing when to accept help. Their son was born on a September morning in 1880. Exactly 2 years after Etta had stepped off the Butterfield coach in Colton's Creek, and they named him Theodore Jonas Archer, Theodore for her father, Jonas for his, which was a decision she made because she thought her father, whatever his failures, deserved to have something named for him by the daughter who had ultimately made use of the one good thing he had left behind. Theodore Jonas Archer was a loud and determined baby with dark eyes like his father, and an auburn tinge to his hair like his mother, and opinions about everything from the first day, which nobody who knew either of his parents found surprising. Miss Halliwell came to see the baby on the 3rd day, bringing a covered dish and a small knitted blanket in yellow wool, and she stood over the cradle Jonas had built from the seasoned wood he had brought Etta that first winter, and she looked at the baby and then at Etta and then at Jonas and said, "Well," in a tone that contained a complete essay. Cal Purdue, who had been Jonas's right hand since the beginning, was the godfather. He accepted this responsibility with the gravity of a man being asked to hold something irreplaceable, and he held the baby with enormous care on the day he met him, his big hands very careful, and said that Theodore was the finest-looking young man he had seen in some time, which was probably not objectively accurate, but was said with such sincere conviction that it had the quality of truth. Even Burl Swan, at the general store the week after the birth, said something that might have been congratulations, though it came out sideways and grudging, and Jonas received it with good grace, because a man with a new son has enough goodwill to extend some to people who don't fully deserve it. The Foster brothers, Henry and Will, who had become fixtures on the farm operation, and whom Etta thought of with the warmth of something between employers and younger brothers, brought a carved wooden rattle and left it on the porch with a note in Henry's careful handwriting that said simply, "For the young mister, with our best regards," and she kept the note for years. The autumn of 1880 had the quality of a life that has found its level. The farm operation had its second harvest, significantly better than the first now that Etta understood the soil's particular needs and had made the adjustments the first year had shown her were necessary. Jonas's cattle numbers had grown steadily with 2 good calving seasons. The house was comfortable and lively with the baby's presence and the extended community of people who moved through it regularly, because Etta had a gift for making their home a place people wanted to be, and Jonas had a gift for making them feel welcome once they got there. In the evenings after Theodore was fed and sleeping in his cradle with its yellow knitted blanket, they sat on the eastern porch and watched the sky go through its colors, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both were equally good. He would reach over sometimes and take her hand without any particular reason, and hold it the way he had that first time in the field with the splinter, unself-consciously and completely. And she would lean her head slightly toward him without quite resting it on his shoulder, a small gesture that was somehow more intimate than larger ones. She thought sometimes about the bedding board at the dry gulch and what it had said about them, and she thought that she understood why the town had done it, not fully understood it, not accepted it, but understood the mechanism of it, which is that people who have been disappointed by their own lives often bet against happiness in others because it is easier than hoping. She did not hold it against them. She had been right and they had been wrong, and there was nothing more satisfying than that. And she was too busy being happy to spend time being aggrieved. In the winter of 1880 going into 1881, she began expanding the eastern fields, adding acreage she had not farmed in the first 2 years because she hadn't been ready. She was ready now. She hired a third hand, a young man from a Mexican family who had settled near the county line, named Raphael, who was 20 years old and enormously capable, and who told her on his first week that he had heard she was the woman who had made Burl Swan move his fence and he had wanted to work for her ever since. Jonas laughed when she told him that. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she had been collecting since the beginning. "You have a reputation," he said. "Good," she said. "Easier than having to establish one from scratch every time." Theodore grew with the particular speed of babies, which never ceases to be astonishing to the people watching it happen. By spring of 1881, he was sitting up and staring at the world with the same intense assessment his mother applied to everything. And Jonas would carry him out to the barn and show him the horses and the cattle with the patient seriousness of a man introducing someone to things he loves. And Etta would watch from the doorway sometimes and feel the kind of full that has nowhere to overflow. Spring of 1881, on a morning in late April when the bluebonnets were coming up along the creek bank, and the grain was a week into its push above the soil, and the sky was the particular blue that happens only in the Texas panhandle in late April. Etta Brenner Archer stood at the fence line of her eastern field and looked at what she had built in 2.5 years on her father's abandoned land. And she thought about the day she had stepped off the Butterfield coach with her carpet bag and her map and her $62 and her stubbornness, and what she had come to decide. She had decided, as it turned out, about everything. The land behind her was greening and growing. The house was solid and alive with daily use. The man she had married was somewhere in the far western pasture checking on the spring calves, and she could see the small figure of him on his roan at the distance, moving along the fence line with the easy deliberateness that was entirely him, and she would have known him by the way he sat a horse at 3 times the distance. Theodore was inside with me Halliwell, who had become a regular visitor in the way of a woman who has decided that a certain family is her family now regardless of blood, and who had taken a particular and proprietorial interest in Theodore's development that everyone found charming. Nobody in Colton's Creek said anything about Etta Brenner Archer needing to go back east. Nobody placed bets on the longevity of her marriage. Tom Delaney's board at the Dry Gulch had long since moved on to other propositions, horses and elections, and whether the new mercantile coming to the county seat would take business from the local stores. What had happened, without announcement or ceremony, was that Etta had simply become part of the fabric of the place. She was on the committee that organized the church school's expanded curriculum, and she was the person most people consulted when they had a question about soil or water rights, because she had made herself an authority through the same stubborn application she brought to everything. She was Jonas Archer's wife in a way that was entirely its own identity, and not a reduction of the identity she had brought with her from Boston, which was the only way she would have consented to be anyone's wife, and which Jonas had understood from the beginning. Jonas rode up along the fence line as she was thinking this and pulled his horse to a stop beside her and looked down at her with that steadiness she had never gotten used to because she hoped she never would. "The calves are good," he said. 23 new ones. That's a good number." "It is." He looked at her looking at the field. "What are you thinking about?" She considered telling him something brief and sideways, the way she sometimes did when she was thinking about something large and didn't want to make it self-conscious by naming it. But she was past that kind of carefulness with him, had been for a long time. "I was thinking about the day I arrived here," she said. "And everything that was decided since then." He was quiet, looking where she was looking. "Are you happy?" he asked, and it was not a question he asked because he doubted the answer, but because he was a man who believed in asking directly about important things rather than assuming. She turned and looked up at him on his horse in the April light, with the bluebonnets behind her and the grain field in front of her, and the house behind the rise of the hill, and the sound of the panhandle wind moving through the tall grass. "Extraordinarily," she said. He swung down from the saddle and stood beside her, and they looked at the field together for a while in the way they had stood in the turned earth 2 years ago, without needing to say anything more about it. Later that same spring, on a warm evening in early May with Theodore on Jonas's knee, and a mockingbird making its elaborate argument somewhere in the cottonwood tree by the creek, Cal Purdue came to supper and brought with him a piece of news that he delivered with a kind of elaborate casualness that did not fool anyone. There was a young woman, he said, who had recently taken the position of schoolteacher at the Colton's Creek Church School, arrived from Oklahoma Territory, and she was, in his estimation, a very sensible person with a good head on her shoulders, and she had mentioned that she admired the way the Archer farm operation was managed. Etta looked at Jonas. Jonas looked at Etta. Theodore, sensing some kind of shared communication happening above him, grabbed Jonas's shirt collar and pulled. "Cal," Etta said, returning her gaze to her guest with great composure, "tell us about her." Cal Purdue, who was 34 years old and had spent those 34 years with a cheerful unconcern about his own romantic situation that had until recently been entirely genuine, turned a color that was not precisely red, but was in that family. Her name was Sarah Ann Holbrook, and she was 28, and she had come from a Quaker family in Oklahoma Territory, and had trained as a teacher, and had a plain, direct way of speaking that Cal apparently found entirely compelling. He had met her when she came to look at a horse his ranch was selling, and he had sold her the horse at a fair price, and then spent 3 days thinking about the transaction and its implications. And now here he was at the Archer supper table mentioning her existence with the elaborate obliqueness of a man who is drowning and pretending to swim. "Invite her to supper," Etta said. "I couldn't just—" "Cal," Jonas said. "Invite her to supper." Cal Purdue invited Sarah Ann Holbrook to supper the following week, and she came and was everything he had suggested, and also funnier and sharper-eyed than he had managed to convey in his oblique description. And she and Etta took to each other immediately in the way that two women with similar internal structures sometimes do. And she and Jonas talked about the cattle operation with the easy directness of two people who both know what they're talking about. And through all of this, Cal Purdue sat at the Archer table and watched the woman he was falling in love with be entirely herself in his favorite place with his favorite people, and felt the particular terrifying happiness of someone who is beginning to understand what they want. They married in the fall of 1881, Cal and Sarah Ann, in the same church where Etta and Jonas had married, and Jonas stood up as Cal's man and Etta stood beside Sarah Ann. And the ceremony was warm and uncomplicated, and the reception at Me Halliwell's had almost exactly the same configuration as the one 2 years before, except that this time, Etta was on the dancing side and Jonas was the one watching from the wall, and he watched her dance and felt exactly what he had felt that first night, which was the uncomplicated happiness that doesn't require language. The winter of 1881 was milder than the previous 2 had been, which everyone in the county took as the land's approval of the general state of things, a logic that would not hold up to scrutiny but which was satisfying to believe. In December, Etta learned she was expecting again. She told Jonas in the kitchen at breakfast on a Monday morning, the same kitchen where she had told him about Theodore, and he stood up from the table and came to her and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and her cheek and her mouth, all 3, before he said anything. When he spoke, he said, "I love you more every day than I did the day before, and I don't know how that keeps working, but it does." "It's a very good system," she said, and he laughed and she held on to him and they stood in the morning kitchen with the fire going and the coffee smell and Theodore making noise in the next room. And it was exactly, precisely, and entirely enough. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1882 on a July morning when the heat was at its most absolute, and the mockingbird in the cottonwood was at its most vocal. They named her Clara Rose Archer. Clara for no particular reason except that it suited her immediately, and Rose for Etta's mother, who had been gone for 3 years now but whose presence Etta still felt in the way she approached difficult things, which was directly and without apology. Clara Rose Archer was, from the first, a different creature than her brother. Where Theodore had been loud and assertive and intensely focused on the physical world, Clara was quieter and watchful, with an expression from the beginning that suggested she was taking notes on everything around her and would draw conclusions in her own time. "She looks like you," Jonas said, the first time he really looked at her properly, 3 days after she arrived. "She looks like herself," Etta said. "She just got here." "She looks like you when you're deciding something," he said. That particular look. Etta looked at her daughter and saw what Jonas meant and laughed. Theodore was 18 months old when Clara arrived and received the news of her existence with the deep suspicion of an only child encountering competition. But he came around within a few weeks, first ignoring her, and then watching her from a careful distance, and then one morning reaching into her cradle and offering her a small smooth stone he had found in the creek, which she grabbed with a solemnity that seemed to satisfy something in him, and after that they were allies. By 1883, the Archer farm and cattle operation had expanded to the point where Raphael had been elevated to full foreman of the farming side, and the Foster brothers were running the livestock management on Etta's portion of the land, and Jonas had taken on 2 additional hands for the cattle ranch itself. What had started as Etta's $62 and her father's untouched parcel and Jonas's years of careful ranching had become something that the county land records now listed as one of the more productive mixed operations in the region. The eastern fields produced wheat and sorghum and some experimental corn that was not yet reliable but showed promise. The western pasture managed a cattle herd that Cal Purdue openly admired and occasionally asked Jonas technical questions about, which Jonas answered with the same patient honesty he applied to everything. Me Halliwell retired from the boarding house in the spring of 1883 and moved into the smaller of her 2 back rooms and rented the front of the house to a young couple from Missouri, and spent considerably more time at the Archer place than her own. A situation that everyone involved pretended was occasional and recognized was essentially permanent. She had become Theodore's primary storyteller, a role she executed with dramatic flair, and Clara's devoted observer, watching the girl with the careful appreciation of someone who recognizes a rare quality and wants to see where it goes. Colton's Creek grew and changed in the way frontier towns of the 1880s did, with the railroad surveys coming through and the prospect of a line within 30 miles of the county generating considerable economic excitement, and the usual arguments about what it would mean for the local cattle operations versus the farming interests. Etta found herself in the middle of these arguments more than once, first because she had opinions, and second because she was one of the few people in the county with both a cattle interest and a farming interest, and could therefore see both sides with some authority. She had testified once before the county commissioner's board on a matter of water rights that affected 3 ranching families and 2 farming operations, and she had done it with the same directness and precision she brought to the surveyor's office, and the fence dispute and everything else. And afterward the commissioner, a red-faced man named Aldous Perry, who was not accustomed to women testifying before his board, said stiffly that Miss Brenner. She had been Miss Brenner when he first knew her, and he had not entirely updated his records, had made a compelling argument, and Jonas, who had been sitting in the second row and watching the whole proceeding with the expression of a man watching someone he loves do something excellent, said nothing at all on the ride home and everything with his silence. "You could have testified yourself," she said. "You know the water rights situation as well as I do." "I know you know it better," he said, And I know you'd say it better. Why would I talk when you're in the room?" She looked at him. "That's either a very nice thing to say or a very convenient thing to say." "Both," he said. "Same thing sometimes." She took his arm, which she rarely did on horseback because it wasn't practical, just briefly, squeezing his forearm through his coat sleeve. And he turned his head and looked at her in the afternoon light with such open and uncomplicated love that she thought sometimes it was still the most astonishing thing she had found in Colton's Creek, more astonishing than the quality of the land or the fierceness of the sky or the particular way the spring came, which was that this man looked at her like that, and had looked at her like that since the first winter, and she could not see any evidence that he would ever stop. The summer of 1883 was long and good, a season of high grass and fat cattle, and the particular golden quality of Texas light in August that settles over everything like a blessing given without comment. On an evening in late August, with the children both asleep in the house and the mockingbird long since silent and the first stars making their appearance over the western horizon, Etta and Jonas sat on the eastern porch the way they had sat on 1,000 evenings before, and he said something that he had been turning over in his mind for a few days, which was characteristic of him. "5 years ago," he said. "5 years ago what?" she said, though she thought she knew. "I thought this land was mine to have," he said. "I thought your father would sell eventually and I'd get it at a fair price and it would all work out the way I'd planned. And instead," she said, "instead," he said, "everything that happened was better than what I planned, and that's the most surprising thing that has ever happened to me, and I think it will stay the most surprising thing." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars coming in over the west. "Do you know what I thought that first morning?" she said. "When I got off the stage and all those men were staring at me. I wasn't there," he said. "I know. But I thought, I am going to decide about this land, and then I am going to decide about my life, and then I am going to act on those decisions, and none of it is going to be shaped by what any of those men think is possible." She paused. "I was thinking about the land. I didn't know yet that the deciding was going to include you. And when you figured that out," he said, "about 2 months in," she said, "I fought it for a little while." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I was fighting the same thing and I could see you doing it," he said. "It was the most frustrating and most interesting 2 months of my life, watching you fight it and fighting it myself. You never said anything. Neither did you." "No," she said. "We were being very careful." "Too careful," he said, which was exactly what he had said in the kitchen in January of their first winter, and she remembered it and smiled. "Much too careful," she agreed. They sat with the stars coming out over the panhandle in the warm August dark, and the house behind them held their sleeping children and their shared life. And the land around them was what they had made of it together, and the town down the road had stopped betting against them so long ago that the memory of it had taken on the quality of a lesson that everyone vaguely remembered, but no longer needed to state explicitly. By spring of 1884, when the bluebonnets came up again along the eastern creek bank, and the grain fields were filling in, and Theodore, now almost 4, was following his father around the cattle operation with the serious attention of someone who intends to have a complete understanding of everything, Colton's Creek had stopped asking when the Archer marriage would run its course, or when Etta would find the frontier too hard, or when Jonas would find his independent wife too complicated. These questions had dissolved into the ordinary reality of 2 people who had built an extraordinary life in an ordinary place, and who did it every day with the unsentimental devotion of people who know what they have. Me Halliwell, in the spring of that year, was sitting on the Archer porch on a Thursday afternoon, helping Clara with the wooden letters she was learning to arrange into words, and she looked up at Etta coming out of the house with a tray of coffee, and said, without particular preamble, that she had thought from the first that these 2 would either be spectacular or catastrophic, and she was very glad it had turned out to be spectacular. Etta set the coffee tray down and looked at the old woman and at her daughter concentrating on her letters and at the fields beyond the fence going green in the April light. "It could have gone the other way," Etta said. Any number of things could have been different. But they weren't, Me said. No, Etta said. They weren't. Jonas came up from the barn with Theodore on his shoulders, and Theodore was holding his hat, which was far too big for him and had fallen over his eyes. And Jonas was walking with exaggerated care, as if carrying something extremely precious, which he was. And Theodore was laughing with the whole body abandon of a small child in a good mood. And Etta watched them come and felt the particular quality of knowing, the bone-deep, uncomplicated certainty that this was it, that this was the thing, that she had found it and built it, and it was real and hers. Clara looked up from her letters and said, very clearly, "Papa," and reached out her arms, and Jonas came up the porch steps and transferred Theodore to the railing with practiced ease, and crouched down to gather Clara up with one arm, while Theodore grabbed the letter blocks with the purposeful intensity of someone who has been watching someone else play with something for too long. Me Halliwell drank her coffee and watched the family on the porch and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the scene itself wasn't already saying with considerably more eloquence. That evening, after the children were in bed and Me had gone back to her own house, Etta and Jonas sat by the fire in the main room, which is what they did in the evenings when the spring air was still cool enough to warrant it, and she was writing in her journal, the one she had kept since before she came to Colton's Creek, and he was reading a book she had recommended, a novel that had come in the last shipment from the Fort Worth bookseller. At some point he looked up from the book and looked at her, and she was writing with the full concentrated attention she gave to everything, the carbon pencil moving across the page, and the firelight made the auburn in her hair bright, and the lines of her face were familiar to him in the way that beloved things become familiar, not less beautiful for being known but more, because knowing is its own kind of seeing. She looked up and caught him looking and raised her eyebrows slightly. "Reading," he said. "Clearly," she said. He smiled and went back to the book, and she went back to her journal, and the fire went about its work. And outside the panhandle night was doing what it had done every night for longer than either of them could imagine, going on vast and starlit over the land they had made their own, over the cattle in the western pasture and the greening grain fields to the east, and the creek running clear along the eastern boundary, and the bluebonnets and the hawks and the high pale grass and all of it, the whole improbable, necessary thing, continuing as it would continue, rooted in the earth and growing toward whatever came next. The whole town had bet against this marriage. By spring, nobody said a word. And in the firelit room, with the children sleeping and the land quiet, and the night doing its generous and ancient work outside, Jonas Archer reached over without looking up from his book and put his hand over Etta's on the table beside her journal, and she turned her hand palm up without looking up from her writing, and their fingers laced together with the ease of people who have done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more, and that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough.